I'm gonna copy a link to a doc I'll paste it in the comments. A lot of it is not super important now, but we'll use it in a little bit. Okay, cool. So, welcome everyone to the lecture. We're gonna keep it pretty light, pretty chill. In general, the more participation we kind of have, so if anyone minds turning on their camera, if not, that's cool. But mostly in terms of answering questions, talking, we're gonna try to keep this as a pretty sort of open floor type lecture, lots of question and answer. So we'll start off with sort of introductions. For those who don't know, am Judah. I debated for McDowell, so you might know the code McDowell JJ better. I know we don't always know people's names, we know codes sometimes. So I did 4 years of LD. Most of that was traditional for the first 2 years. Then I did 2 years on the circuit. So I was able to make that transition my junior year. So I have a little bit of knowledge on that. And then I'll be debating college policy at Dartmouth next year. But I was a small school debater for my whole career. I mostly competed without coaching, and I mostly read the critiques specifically about anti-Blackness. Yeah, so what we're going to do here today is we're going to be learning about the structural critique. So first we'll go over what that sort of is, what its different parts are, and what the goals are of it. That'll include sort of a few examples, some activities that'll help us grow our understanding of it. There will be a pretty good focus on anti-Blackness literature, just because that is what I'm drawing from in my understanding, and also what I've the best sort of prep and to use to explain to you guys on. So we'll start with that. We'll have a little bit of talk about both going for and answering structural critiques. And then after that, once we're kind of through with the more lecture side, we'll do just some general Q&A that can be about anything we talked about today or anything else that you guys might have questions about. So first on the structural critique, we got to start off with breaking that down. We're going to start off with what is a critique. So I think we went over some of this, or you guys went over some of this in your labs this morning. Does anyone want to give sort of an explanation of what a critique is? All answers are good answers. They help us build. Yeah, Neil, go ahead.
A critical view on an assumption that the opponent makes in their arguments.
Exactly. Yeah. So a critique, I really like how you said a critical view. So it's sort of a understanding of things, or a view or a lens of looking at the world that criticizes the assumptions that another team made. Specifically, when we're looking at the structural critique, we're going to base a lot of our sort of discussion on the negative critique because it's the most straightforward. So in this case, you would be criticizing an assumption that the affirmative made when they read the plan. Cool. So that's our critique side. Now, dealing with specifically the structural critique, our next sort of leading question is, who has an idea of what a structure might be? If I say the word structure in a debate context, what do you sort of think of? And you can use the raise hand function. You can feel free to just kind of unmute and say it out or anything like that.
I guess in the context of the critique, it would be like a structure of power, whether that be misogyny, I don't know, racism or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I like the way you said structure of power. A lot of critiques have to do with power, or who has the ability to sort of do certain things, or who doesn't have the ability to do certain things, any sort of action within society. And so a structure is a large overarching system that sort of determines how people exist in the world. So for example, we got the examples of misogyny or racism. Things like capitalism are structures. The state or governments are structures. Society itself can be a structure. And so structural critiques are critiques that are based in criticizing a specific part of a structure and then how the affirmative has invested in it. So you may have heard in someone's like framework blocks or responses to critique where they say, oh, the critique is just like a big FYI about like how society exists. But a structural critique specifically should be talking about how the affirmative or how the resolution is invested in or based in certain structures that create forms of violence. And so now we got to ask sort of how does this differ from other types of critiques? So you may have heard lots of different types of critiques. There's sometimes reps Ks, there's language critiques, there's all types of different critiques that are meant to criticize assumptions that the other team has made in very specific ways. But a structural critique is different because it's largely concerned with the implication of the affirmative. So that's the way it would be implemented, the effects of its politics, the specific impacts that they chose to resolve, etc. So there's lots of different types of critiques. Some of the like sort of folklore on critiques is that the first critique was made when the practice of spreading was introduced, and they said, oh, that's kind of ableist. That would be a critique that chooses to sort of challenge the way that the AF has been presented, or like the practices of the team. But a structural critique is more concerned with what you might hear called post-fiat implication, or sort of the way that the affirmative and the plan are actually passed, and what type of effects that has on the larger systems and individuals who are positioned by those larger systems. So the best examples of structural critiques are most variations of things like capitalism or biopower, which criticizes the state. And there's many variations of settler colonialism and literature of anti-Blackness like Afropessimism that we would consider structural critiques. That's because they have to do with larger structures of settler colonialism, how settlerism is based in sort of creating a large structure that is violent towards indigenous and colonized peoples. Or anti-Blackness literature, much of it is concerned with how a structure of white supremacy and a structure of anti-Blackness creates large systems of violence, not just the other team did something racist. And so that's really important because we have to recognize that the structural critique criticizes the affirmative plan and not the affirmative debater. So it does not say that the AF debater should lose because they're anti-Black or capitalist, or they didn't talk about anti-Blackness or capitalism, but it says that their plan and the AF case benefits from or requires the use of structures that are capitalist or settler colonialist or anti-Black. So it's very specific in terms of how we sort of think about and understand politics in the context of the affirmative, and what it says about the specific maybe link chain that they understood, or the impacts that they chose to resolve, or those types of things. So it has to do with the content of the affirmative and how that's embedded in larger structures that they often ignore, or that they did ignore when they read the affirmative. Similarly, most structural critiques will not say you should vote for me as a debater because I'm this identity, or you should vote for me because I talked about this identity. So structural critiques are often given the reputation that they're talking about specific individuals, but it's distinct because they're talking about larger structures. So a critique that sort of is concerned with the individual actions of a debater, or concerned with maybe any sort of other practice within the round, that would not be an example of a critique that is structural. The gendered language critique is a really good example. It talks about a system of gender, but if you say that, oh, using language that's gendered, for example, if a card isn't really talking in the context of a specific person, but uses he, him pronouns and refers to individuals as he, him generically. Or if, there's the critique that says you shouldn't say the F word because it's a sort of masculine aggressive language. Those types of things are critiques that are not necessarily structural in the context of debate, because even though they have to do with structures, they criticize a specific practice that the affirmative took on. Yeah. And then the last thing to note about structural critiques is that very few critiques are only ever about one thing. So multiple arguments that will come together to form a critique, which means that structural critiques will incorporate arguments about the representations of the affirmative, their language, and more. But the type of critique that you go for largely depends on why you want the judge to vote for you. So if I say that the affirmative has used a certain type of language or talked about a certain group in a specific way, that can be part of a structural critique. But what distinguishes different types of critiques and different types of arguments that are criticizing the affirmative is why I want the judge eventually to vote for me. If I say that their language demonstrates the way that their politics is sort of exclusionary of specific groups, that it excludes certain groups from their calculus and their analysis, and that means they'll create classism or anti-Blackness or settler colonial violence when they pass the policy, then that is a structural critique. if I say you should vote this debater down because the language that they said is racist and that's a bad practice for debate, that would be an example of a different type of critique. And so you should think about these types of critiques in the context of what are they meant to achieve and what is sort of the impact, and then what is the general framework argument that you are presenting to the judge in terms of why they should vote for you. And so being able to separate that out is really, really good, because it gives you a good understanding of sort of what type of argument you actually want to be going for, which gives you better round vision, but two, allows you to articulate to judges sort of why they specifically should vote for you, not as a debater, but why they should vote for this set of arguments that you are giving. Cool. Okay, so now is where we're gonna hop on to the doc that I sent out. So I will wait. Is there anybody who still needs to get onto that, or is everybody good? Suraj, yeah.
I was just saying I need to get onto the doc.
Oh, okay, I got you. Do you see it in the chat, or should I post it again?
Can you post it again, please?
Yeah, I got you. All right, and is everyone good? Is there anyone who's not good? Okay. So we are going to do a little bit of sort of what I call close reading. So we're going to read through some evidence together, break it down, and sort of practice identifying different structures or what these different parts of the critique sort of mean, and why they're important. So the first part of a critique is our theory of power, right? So we should have learned this in lab today, which is awesome. So our theory of power is sort of our theory about how the world works. So we said a structural critique is different from others because of that word structural. And what did we say a structure was? Who wants to give a refresher? That's cool. We said a structure was anything that sort of positions or places individuals in a larger system, right? Or a larger system that determines how individuals are sort of able to act or interact with society. So we're going to start on the theory of power, because that in a structural critique is a lot of times sort of the biggest thing, right? Structural critiques are oftentimes won and lost at the theory of power, because if you lose that your theory of power is true, then you lose that that structure exists. And if all of your impacts, all of the reasons to vote for you are based on the idea that this structure creates bad impacts, this structure excludes certain people, et cetera, if you lose that structure exists, then you lose the round, right? Because none of your links matter. The alternative doesn't really matter because it doesn't have the link to solve, et cetera. So identifying what the theory of power is really key is really key. We'll get to that, why that is, in a second. But first, everyone's favorite, Wilderson 10. We're going to take a little bit, read through this. Actually, I'll read it out, and then we're going to talk about what specifically sort of is the structure. So Wilderson 10, it says, natal alienation, general dishonor, and gratuitous violence have turned individuals of myriad ethnicities and races into beings who are socially dead, but blackness refers to an individual who is by definition always already void of relationality. Modernity marks a new ontology in an era in which an entire race appears that is prior to the transgressive act, stands as socially dead. Chattel slavery as a condition of ontology and not just as an event of experience stuck to the African. Draw a distinction between the experience of slavery, which anyone can be subjected to, and ontology, which in modernity becomes a singular purview of the black. And so we'll end the card there. So this is going to be sort of our example where we break it down, and then we're going to practice identifying some more specific structures based on theories of power from other critiques coming in the next cards. But the first one is, you can see that I pulled out this quote where it says natal alienation, general dishonor, and gratuitous violence. So those are our three warrants for what Wilderson would call social death, right? Which is the exclusion of blackness and black people from being people or participating in any sort of social life. So the exclusion from not just politics or like being able to like vote, for example, but the exclusion from society itself and being able to participate within society, social institutions, and being considered part of society. So blackness is completely excluded because of natal alienation, general dishonor, and gratuitous violence. During the Q&A, we can definitely get more into that if people have questions about that. But for now, those are sort of explanations of things that continue from slavery and continue to kind of create this dynamic of slavery that excludes Black people from society. And so that has this word, that creates this word modernity, which is the modern world, right? And so the structure in this instance would be modernity or civil society. The idea that the modern world and modern society is a structure in which all people except for Black people are capable of participating, enjoying things like, yes, being able to vote or participate in politics, but also generally having things like you would understand through Enlightenment thought, things that are considered individual personal rights, liberties, the respect of those rights and liberties, generally being seen as a person and a human to be incorporated within society. And so all of those things are things that people who are in the structure of society get to experience. But Wilderson says that that is the structure we are critiquing because Black people are excluded from that structure. Does anyone have any questions about that? Okay, awesome. So that's our first example of, we pulled out some of these lines, right? So the words natal alienation, general dishonor, and gratuitous violence, that would be our warrant for the structure or the explanation of why Black people exist outside of society and why the structure is bad. And then we have this phrase modernity. So modernity would be the structure, and it has a new ontology. So ontology is specifically, ontology could be summarized as the theory of being, or specifically in this instance, the understanding of how people are able to have this sort of social life, but there's a new ontology for Blackness in which it's excluded. And so ontology is the specific aspect or the specific part of the larger structure that Wilderson is critiquing. So now let's jump down to the Sharp card. Christina Sharp writes about what she calls the wake. And so we're going to look at the wake. We're going to take some time, and then we're going to, as a group, sort of together break down what is the specific structure that Sharp is critiquing. And this is where participation becomes super, super important. So it's really good, even if you don't feel super confident, to get your thoughts out there, have a discussion, and sort of break down what we're thinking based on sort of Sharp's theory. And so once we read through the card, we'll sort of ask for some participation and have everyone sort of contribute. So Sharp 16, the weather comes, breaks, changes quickly, lets loss, is remarked upon and forgotten. The weather is the totality of our environments, total climate that is anti-Black. Slavery undeniably became the total environment. In the wake, the weather and drowning are death, disaster, and possibility. Memories reanimate the places and spaces of slavery, post-nominative emancipation, slave law transformed into lynch law, and administrative logics that remember enslavement. Its duration expands into supposed emancipation and beyond. Slavery was not singular, it was a singularity, a weather event, likely to occur around a particular time. Emancipation did not make Black life free, it continues to hold us. The brutality was not singular, it was the singularity of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is as pervasive as climate. The weather necessitates changeability and improvisation. It produces new ecologies, the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and their physical surroundings, the political movement that seeks to protect the environment, especially from pollution. The weather transforms Black being, but the shift that held in those in the wake also produce out of the weather their own ecologies. Okay, so that's a lot of words, right? Critical literature is always a lot of words, a lot of very dense words, but just general thoughts on what Sharp is saying here. Anyone who wants to go?
Wait, what was the question?
Yeah, just what are everyone's general thoughts on what is the structure that Sharp is talking about in this card, and what is sort of like
Anti-Blackness.
What's that?
Anti-Blackness.
Good. Yeah. Okay. So on face value, it's anti-Blackness, right? The idea that, so that's like our sort of large understanding of things is anti-Blackness. Now let's take it a step further, because Sharp is making a few claims that are a little bit more specific than that. So anti-blackness is the general claim, but what specifically about anti-blackness? And let's look at...
He's saying that like institutionalized racism is still embedded through like every like facet of society, and that despite like alleged progress in the past, it's still very much dangerous.
Good. So now we're getting more specific, right? So we had anti-blackness generally. Now I like what you said, especially at the start, that it's specifically the dynamic of slavery, right? So we've gone that there are certain continuities in slavery, or certain dynamics or things about slavery that continue to sort of control how, or dominate how Black people are able to participate in society. So that's good. That would be this sort of part, if you can see on the doc where I'm highlighting, where it says slave law transformed into lynch law, into Jim and Jane Crow, and other administrative logics that remember enslavement. So that's good. I want to look about...
The car also says that like I read the unhighlighted part of it, also says that like creating like ecologies of resistance, like specifically by like understanding like the Black state, is crucial for resistance.
Good. Yeah. So that word ecology specifically is where we're going with this, right? I like that you pulled that word out. That's good. So the idea of ecologies now, let's go to the definition where Sharp defines ecologies, right? It produces new ecologies, the branch of biology that deals with the relation of organisms to one another and their physical surroundings, right? So it's this idea that connects also with what Sharp is saying at the top, which is that the weather is the totality of our environments, total climate that is anti-Black, right? So Sharp here is making a connection between slavery and anti-Blackness, which is society, the state, which is politics, and then ecology, which is, yes, the climate, but also the way that individuals relate to their environments that are around them. And so understanding that takes us to the next level of analysis, right? So it makes sure that, well, there's two sides of it. If you are going for this critique, right, it makes sure that every sort of rebuttal does not end up being super generic and having the judge go, well, I didn't really think it was specific to the affirmative, or I didn't think it was specific to the round, and so I don't see how it relates, right? And then you lose the round because of that. If you are responding to the critique, it makes sure that you are not just reading the same sort of generic blocks and responses to every critique about anti-Blackness or every argument about anti-Blackness, and then losing because you're not responding to debaters who are giving very good and specific analysis on anti-Blackness. And so that's good. So that's what we want to be doing when we sort of narrow down these structural critiques, as we want to understand them not all being the same. Like every anti-Blackness critique is not Afropess, right? Most of them are, one, because Afropessimism has a very specific context and debate, and two, because there are a lot of sort of literature bases that could be considered Afropessimism, but not every critique about anti-Blackness is going to be like Wilderson, for example. And so being able to narrow down what sort of that critique is actually saying is key. The same is true about things like the CAPK, for example, right? Capitalist or anti-capitalist like theory is one of the most broad and diverse sort of set of literature bases that exists. So being able to understand what specifically a critique of capitalism is saying is super key. Understanding what specifically a critique of settler colonialism is saying is key. Or even a new critique that you have never seen in your life that makes some sort of overarching claim about a structure or about society. Being able to understand what specifically that critique is sort of trying to say is key. So that was really good. Now we're going to move down to this Gillespie card. This is a little bit more complex. If you've read Baudrillard before, you'll be pretty excited to see if you enjoyed Baudrillard before, you'll be excited to see this. But yeah, so looking at Gillespie 17, it says, Black life is lived in white hyperreality, lived as a symbol of death. Blackness exists only as white being structures it on to anti-Black violence. The paradigm where consciousness is unable to distinguish between fictions by white being and the real. This permits Black death to be subsumed in simulations by each encounter with the world. Questions like, can the black suffer, arise due to inability to communicate a harm that can never end without ending the world. Viral videos of Black Death, more than opening the possibility for justice, suture the relationship between the mythical and the real that perpetuates itself through the reification of Black trauma. Black Death seems to extend its hyperreality. Black Death makes it harder to distinguish white fictions from real harm being done to the human flesh. The white world subjects the Black to perpetual violence, then uses that violence as evidence to suggest the Black is not human. Violence secures the semiotics of the white hyperreality. White Disneyland stays intact. White being continues to center Black Death as the matrix of possibility, for its hyperrealist structure indexes the promise of death insofar as white being is promised futurity. So, as with anything related to hyperreality, that is like a lot of words, right? A lot of very complex, critical words that sound like a lot. So I think we'll probably try to get pretty deep and pretty in depth with this one. But who has an idea of what Gillespie sort of might be saying, or what is the claim that he is sort of trying to make here? And this is one especially where wrong answers are good answers, because they'll help us sort of understand or break down common misconceptions about sort of the critique. So if you have sort of any thoughts at all about the Gillespie card that we read.
Wait, is it talking about how like it talked about the white hyperreality? Is that talking about how like a world constructed by like the views and perspectives of white individuals, and how how blackness suffers from that?
Yeah, that's actually very, very, very spot on. So the idea is that not necessarily even the perspectives of white individuals, but that whiteness as a concept and as a structure produces a almost like a simulation to where the perspectives of individuals can only sort of understand things through what whiteness allows us to understand it as. And so then you are exactly right that that creates suffering that Black people suffer from for a few reasons. First, because ways of expressing anti-Black violence are cut out because we only know sort of the perspectives that are capable of being allowed to know by whiteness when it creates that sort of simulation. But then also because in order to reinforce that position, acts of anti-Black violence are used to reinforce and restate the sort of power and position of whiteness in order to create that reality. So that's exactly right. Did anybody catch the explanation of why that's true, the warrant for why that structure exists? That's okay. The warrant is this idea of the reification of Black trauma, right? That we talked about. That questions like, quote, can the Black suffer is what Gillespie talks about, right? That question comes up because we lack an ability to explain why we continue to see acts of anti-Black violence, right? So the answer there is complex because there is a warrant in the card, right? There's a warrant in the card. You maybe, depending on who's reading it, get a warrant in cross-examination that is well explained as far as why, like what the warrant for why the structure exists is. But on the flip side, the warrant with a lot of structural critiques, with things like Gillespie, especially, that are very dense and complex. There is not a super clear and intuitive and easy warrant as far as why those structures exist. The same can be said about a lot of things that, a lot of theories where a lot of judges just don't believe that the sort of warrant for any structural critique is going to be super intuitive. Or another thing like just straight up Baudrillard, the warrant is not always super intuitive. Or even if it's intuitive, it takes a lot of time to be able to explain, time that that debaters often don't have, right? So understanding the sort of weaknesses or the sort of depth of theories and where to chink away at is going to be super, super important because it allows you to sort of make sort of chips and breaks in like the theories when you're debating in later debates, especially. All right. Now we're gonna go to something a little bit more plain languaged. That is gonna be this Odd 20 card that's next. So Odd 20. Is there anyone who wants to read the card out loud, or are we good with me reading? Okay, awesome. I'll read. So on 20, it says the black person experiences law as an absolute violence on their being and is always already marked as the criminal that enables the law's possibility. Black life is constituted by illegality. We can attribute this to slavery. Black people appear in the law as objects managed through legal slavery. Every place had its own laws regarding slavery. These laws all have the same function: to restrict the movement and assembly of the enslaved, permit the killing of the enslaved. Slavery was the legal precedent for dealing with blackness and provided foundations for the means by which blackness appears within the law today. Law deprived the enslaved of modes of personhood that enable freedom's possibility. Aims of this ontological project was to provide legal ground for slavery's continuation, regulating blackness to property. It is the law's goal to contain blackness and keep it from breaching this line. To maintain slavery's coherence, law became a means to make distinction between human and black tangible. The law became the first site in which slavery and racism were institutionalized. So what is the structure that Ade is targeting and talking about in this card?
Legalism or the state.
Exactly. Yeah. So specifically, legalism, I think, is a really great word. Ade talks specifically about the sort of history of the law. Did anyone catch a warrant as far as why blackness is sort of positioned outside of legalism and legality in the law?
Was it because like before there was like structures for slavery and all in the law, and like that's the way the judiciality has been like worked?
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly it. So that structures of the law sort of first come into appearance and first come into existence when black people are slaves. And also specifically, Ade is super clear that the first sort of time that blackness is even racial blackness is brought into the law is through slavery. So the reason that blackness is even written into law is to justify and create sort of boundaries and mechanisms for slavery to exist. And so that relationship is what means, as long as we see things like as long as we see sort of these same overarching legal structures, blackness will always sort of occupy a position of slavery within the law. How does this differ from Wilderson, for example? So we read Wilderson earlier, and a lot of it, when you first kind of read it, seems pretty similar. But how would this be different?
I feel like this connects to biopolitics more, like Foucault and his whole concept on how like modern states will like exert control over populations.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, yeah, I think the focus on the word states there is what's really key, right? So we saw that because like what biopower Foucault, for example, would say is that these sort of larger structures operate specifically and uniquely through the state. Whereas Wilderson makes a overarching claim that society sort of social institutions and civil society excludes blackness from being in the category of the human, and that you lack the ability to participate socially, and that's a result of sort of social causes. Ade makes the claim that sure, there is a social exclusion, but that social exclusion follows specifically a legal understanding of blackness. That the law is what created and codified this understanding of blackness within society, and that the law functions mainly to uphold that, and that the law is the root cause. Very, very good. That's exactly right. So why might that become important? Who has sort of an idea of why that would become important, or why that distinction would be important? And there are a lot of reasons. So any idea that you have as far as why that, like, maybe would become important in a debate specifically. We'll say we'll start with when you're going for the critique. So if you were going for this critique, why would it be important to understand that distinction? That's cool. If there's no ideas, the reason why it's important to understand that distinction is because you sort of need to understand what the claim that you're trying to make is. Not in the sense of just like extending the theory of power in the 2NR, but everything else should be built around what specific structure that you're targeting, right? So your links should all be based on claims that are made in the theory, not in the sense that if you read like a Wilderson theory that you have to read a link from Wilderson, but your links should be based on the same sort of understanding of the world and that specific understanding of the world that your theory of power is based on. Your alternative should solve specific sort of problems and specific claims that you made when you read the critique, and then it should resolve the specific links, right? Your framework arguments should all be worded and contextualized and talked about in ways that are related to the specific structure and the specific problem that you have identified. The same goes for responding to critiques, right? So if you have like one generic framework file and you say, I'm going to read this against anything that is sort of anti-blackness because I can't prep every critique, then that's good. But then you should also leave spaces to contextualize sort of specific links, right? Specific arguments about structures that are made, all of those types of things. On both sides of debating the critique, specificity is what wins and loses debates. And so the more unique and specific you can be to identifying claims that are being made and identifying what specific structures are, the better off you'll be. Awesome. There is, yeah, we'll read this last card. So this last card, Thorson 15. A Black aesthetic of the domestic consists of celebration of Black women, focus on Black subjects, and interest in the way domestic space shapes the public sphere. The space is domestic in terms of focus on the U.S. and focus on home spaces. The home is a model for the national. I use the domestic to refer to the U.S. state and private home. These meanings of domestic are mutually constitutive. Interior life is central to the Black domestic. Spillers calls this the capacity to draw the outer into oneself, retranslating into an altered exterior. Conflict between African American women's domestic labor and others' home and the ability to tend to one's own hearth means Black people's domestic work was never only personal. Historical conditions that shape Black women's work mean cultivating the domestic have specifically African American functions. These are necessarily political. All right. So based on this card, Thorson makes a very specific claim, right? And a very specific structure. Does anyone have sort of an idea of what specifically Thorson is targeting as sort of a subject area of interest, and what is like the sort of structure that they're talking about? And this one is a little bit different from some that you may have seen before, so we'll use a little help. The specific sort of structure that's being targeted is anti-Blackness in the context of domestic space, right? So Thorson talks specifically about how there is sort of an inherent relationship between political work and domestic work. That means Black people's home spaces are always and already related to politics. This was for the housing topic. So basically what this critique is saying is that the affirmative refusing to have a proper analysis on specifically what the home space already means for Black people. Also, the idea that you have made this a political process and said that home spaces, where people live, how people operate, all these types of things, that you have brought that under the power of the state, said that that is a choice for you to sort of determine where Black people live, means that you are dominating those forms of labor by making it into a policy. You are bringing it under your own hands and sort of making forms of Black labor into being under the state. So that's good. So here is a really good example of the structural critique as a very specific claim, right? So sometimes you will see overarching literature bases like Afropessimism. People will read Wilderson on every topic, and then they'll cut specific links related to the topic. This is an example of how a structural critique can operate or be cut for a specific topic, right? So the structural critique does not always have to critique very large overarching structures and then contextualize it to the topic, but it can be more specific to the topic specifically and critique a certain structure that exists within the context of the topic. Cool. So now we'll deal with the links. The links, we will not read through the specific links that are in the topic here, but they're really good for if you go back later and review notes. Your links on a structural critique should always be very specific. The two parts that you can break up a link into are how does the affirmative relate to the structure, and then what is the impact of how the affirmative relates to the structure. You oftentimes with the structural critique will have a lot more focus on the first part of the link than you will on the second, because if you are winning that there is a structure that exists that is violent and exclusionary, the impact becomes super intuitive, right? If I say that anti-blackness exists, and then I win a super specific link that says the affirmative is an active investment in anti-blackness, then the impact is you make more anti-blackness, you create more anti-black violence, those types of things. Impacts that are more specific are great, but a lot of times those more specific impacts will be specifically related. It'll be that you create anti-blackness in X place or in Y way, right? And so that is related to the specificity of the link, right? And how specifically the affirmative has developed a link, or how the affirmative has invested in this larger system, which is the link. So if you are on the negative, your goal, and this starts mostly with your pre-tournament prep, your goal when you're cutting any sort of critique is to be thinking about the most specific links possible, right? So in terms of your pre-tournament prep, you should be looking for you should be looking for links that are very hard to the topic and the wording of the topic. And then you should also be trying to cut links that are very specific to very like core AFs, right? So there's always a couple sort of AFs that are very specific, sort of like policy LARP type AFs that are very big on every topic, right? So let's say that there's like a specific prep group that's really big. You know, they're all reading this policy AF, cutting a couple links to that AF, cutting a couple links to if there's a specific school that's really big and they cut a bunch of, and they are all reading the same AF, cutting links to that AF, right? So that can be stalking people's wikis, looking at the entry list for a tournament that you're going to is really helpful for that. But you want as specific of links as possible to affirmatives and then also to the topic. Not just generic links that deal with the subject matter of the topic, but for example, the housing topic. A link that is about public housing policy as a thing, right? That is like, an AF has to defend that if it's topical, and then if it's not, you can just read T. But any like topical AF, any policy AF, having links that are going to be able to link to anything there is super important. On the flip side, when you are the affirmative and you are debating against the critique, being able to distance the affirmative from the link is your biggest goal. Because if they are not winning a link, then the critique becomes a big, massive FYI about like capitalism exists, or anti-blackness exists, or settler colonialism exists. So your goal is to say that the affirmative does not invest in these systems just because it exists within these systems. So if I say, for example, that the world, if I'm reading PES, or if my opponent is reading PES and I'm reading a policy AF, right? My goal is to say, just because, like, your theory, the theory of Afropessimism has said that that Black people are socially dead because of the way that the whole world is constructed, right? The entire world is constructed around anti-Blackness, and that happens in every instance of society, politics, etc. Well, that makes for a really great argument if they have not won a super specific link that says that I, as the affirmative, don't just never do anything and just let Black people die from anti-Blackness. We can at least, for example, solve extinction because Black people still die from extinction. right? If they have not won a specific link, it makes Way's case arguments very specific, right? I say, well, we can still sort of stop extinction. We can prevent Black people from dying. Really good affirmatives will have some sort of card built into either a framework section or even built into the advantage is even better that says we also have impacts that sort of decrease inequality, that resolve certain aspects of racism, etc. So whoever is more able to be specific with who they help and who is like sort of what their impacts are, what they're resolving, is oftentimes going to be the winner of clash debates and K debates. So being able to say that just because the world is anti-Black doesn't mean the affirmative is, saying we are able to materially change something about the world. We are able to distance ourselves from those systems, or at least we don't create a unique investment in those systems. We don't create an increase in those systems. Saying that as the affirmative is what is going to win you a lot of clash debates. So that's the link. Awesome. Now we'll move on to the alternative. The alternative, in a lot of instances, can be, depending on who you ask, the strongest and or weakest part of a critique. Alternatives get a pretty good reputation for not doing much with structural critiques, especially. There are a lot of instances where some of them will be very non-material and abstract. Some of them will be incredibly material and still probably don't resolve a lot, right? So the CapK, for example, could have an alt that says there's a worldwide socialist revolution. If you don't really have specificity as to how that solves the links, then it's like you're not really solving much, right? The flip side would be something like Afropessimism, which has an alt of a lot of times uses the alternative of a unflinching analysis of anti-Blackness. And so in that instance, it's just, again, you'll hear the word mindset shift, right? So in that instance, the idea is just like, oh, you just change the way you think, right? So when you are the negative, your alternative with a structural critique should not try to resolve the entirety of the system, right? Your argument is not that the alternative for Afropessimism will mean that the world quite literally ends, right? Or that the social world quite literally ends, and that you can do that in this instance. When you are debating the alternative for the CapK, you should probably not frame your alternative as we will quite literally bring the downfall of capitalism. But your alternative should resolve the links that you outlined in your critique. And so what that looks like is being able to deal with specific problems that you have outlined with the affirmative. So this is where specificity in every part will build on it, right? So specificity at the theory of power is good because it will build really good specificity on your links. And when you have really specific links, then it makes the alternative a lot easier because it makes it super, super easy to articulate to the judge when you've won a specific link that we are not claiming will solve all of capitalism or all of anti-Blackness. We're not saying that we'll sort of get rid of like all of these systems. We're just saying that the affirmative has uniquely invested in them. We can prevent an increase in them and solve a very specific or unique part of that structure. We can solve specific impacts in the way that specific people are affected, or the way that people are affected in very unique ways by those systems. We can prevent that from happening. And so when you frame your alternative like that, it becomes a lot more viable and a lot more feasible. Yeah. Does anyone have any questions about link debating or alt debating when it comes to structural critiques, whether it's going for or answering? Yeah, what's up?
Let's say like so like you're reading like a non-topical chaos, then like how would you like link to like problem, I guess?
Yeah. I think that chaos a lot of times will operate a little bit differently. But in that instance, especially when it comes to a chaos that's built in a structural critique, your link to problems are based in the resolution. So that could be very, very specific wording of the resolution, or sort of more general ideas that are tied to the resolution. and you, it also depends on sort of what level of topical you're trying to be. So if you are creatively interpreting and sort of redefining specific words in the resolution, then that is sort of different, because the problems that you would be, quote, linking to is like a lot of like politics types links, right? So the idea that we all have to come and pass a plan, or the idea that we all have specific types of knowledge that are accepted and debate should only care about those. If you are being farther and farther from topical, then the links would probably have to do more so with sort of like the subject generically, and that would depend a lot more on the topic. But in general, your links can be a lot less specific on the AF, because you don't really have any like specific ground and you're kind of talking about what you want to talk about. So you're a lot less limited. But yeah. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does for the most part, but if it's like completely non-topical KF, then like just do the links work the same way?
Yeah, in that instance, I think that the link would be debate. So you have to sort of come in with a very, very, like, if it's like completely non-topical, not meant to be about the topic, not meant to be about anything, and you're saying like, this is what we care about, and we don't care about any of that, we only care about like this issue, right? And we're not even worried about the topic, then your links should be more to things like debate, topic changing, like resolutional stasis, or the idea of like a stable resolution that both sides come in and talk about and the judge votes and picks. It could be anything related to that, but your links, kind of the farther from being topical you are, the kind of more your link would sort of zoom out and be a lot less specific to content and a lot more specific to form. So your links start to be more and more about debate and sort of how we think about debate, the less topical you are. Does that kind of answer it a little bit more?
Yeah, that answers it. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. Okay, so we dealt with theory of power, link, and alternative. Our last argument is framework. So this is where I think that the structural critique becomes super helpful, super important, and also very applicable, at least in my experience, because it massively decreases the amount of, I don't want to say it decreases the amount of prep that you need to do, but it massively decreases the burden on you to have specificity. If you run into an app that you just don't have a specific link for, if you are running into debaters that are just very good at beating you back on the link and beating you back on the alternative, especially, and you're losing the alt, then the framework page becomes your best friend, because you can frame out entire pieces of content of the affirmative, right? So winning arguments, and we can look at this framework card in here. I won't read it out, but there's a Wilderson card and two Warren cards that all kind of get at very similar things, which is that the social aspect, or sort of the ontological aspect, the metaphysical aspect, all of these things about the way that Blackness relates to society precedes political solutions, precedes politics, comes before the way that Black people are meant to operate with the state. That if you do not answer these questions about how Black people exist within society, you will not be able to use political solutions to solve those social problems. And so this is just an example for how that would work with anti-Blackness. But in general, your framework page that tells the judge, these are the impacts you care about, this is how you evaluate the round. And not only do that, but base it on evidence and base it on critical scholarship. Those arguments will help you win debates that you did not think you would win, that you are way behind in, that you're not really winning a super strong link, right? But if you are sort of able to win a theory of power and a framework argument and like half a link, you will be able to win, right? It makes it really easy to have like link operates as a disad type argument. So you say, even if we don't win the alternative, we're winning that the link has shown that you create a very unique impact through the affirmative, and that the judge should not vote for you because you have, like, under our framework and under the way that the judge should evaluate the round, you have invested in a system that is anti-Black, and that is bad, right? It makes for really great argument. It generally lowers your threshold for winning a link, because it says, judge, your first like priority should be evaluating at this level, and we just need to win a chance that they invest in that system, and that's really, really bad. It takes out a lot of art. I don't want to say it makes the AF irrelevant, but if the AF goes for these arguments that, oh, the link doesn't matter that much because we're still able to solve Black people from extinction, or we're still able to decrease inequality, which helps Black people, a framework page says, well, no, you are just, again, changing forms of anti-Blackness, or you are just changing the forms of the structure. You are invested in serial policy failures, a really common framework argument that says, like, the sort of theory creates solutions that, like, sort of on paper work in the short term, but eventually the policy fails and gets rolled back and invests in larger systems. Like, capitalism is the reason, or anti-Blackness is the reason that policies fail, right? So winning your framework page is your best friend, especially as if you are not super like well endowed in terms of resources and prep. If you are a small school debater, an independent debater, all these types of things, a framework page, getting good at sort of winning a framework page and winning framework will help clear up a lot of rounds, make your 2NRs super, super easy, and just generally make things a lot easier. Does anyone have any questions about framework or anything sort of related to that part? Okay, awesome. So that is just about all that I have. For an overview, we went over sort of the 4 parts of the structural critique, what that means in the context specifically of structures and how that would sort of differ from other critiques. And yeah, the cards are in there. These are your guys's to, keep or have. Feel free to make a copy if you'd like to edit it. I think there's links to everything, but if you're interested in any of the literature, I can also send PDFs or files for stuff that's not sort of in there. And yeah, that's pretty much everything. So for our second slot, we had slotted just kind of some time for general Q&A on the critique, the structural critique, debate in general, anything. So if anyone has any questions, does anyone, sort of have any questions on anything like that, anything debate related in general, thoughts on literature bases, things like that?
Does the literature and like learning about stuff kind of work the same thing for like postmodern critiques?
Yeah, I think that postmodern critiques are even more like I would consider a lot of postmodern critiques structural critiques because most of them make very large claims about the world and sort of how it works. I think that in that case, they're even less dependent on the link and more dependent on the theory. And so the biggest challenge there is understanding postmodern theorists because they talk a lot and they use a lot of big words. But being able to understand that and win your theory is super, super key. But yeah, the process is and the way that you think about it is largely the same, and can follow a pretty generally similar structure. Was there I guess I should ask, was there a specific sort of like postmodern author or theory that you had in mind, or?
I mean, I've just been trying to learn how to run because like I live in a very trad state, so I'm trying to learn how to like run a critique in the first place. Because like I run some of like the basic ones, but some of the more complex ones are like more important. So I read like Baudrillard and then like Heidegger and stuff. So those are like really heavy and really complex.
Okay. Yeah. No. Baudrillard and Heidegger are both very complex and very wordy, but they're also like relatively well known enough that your threshold for explaining them and articulating them will sometimes be a little bit lower than a postmodern author who's maybe a little bit more niche. But I think that that's definitely an uphill battle when you're first starting. If you can get very good at it, though, you can be very, very successful with both of those authors. But I would say in general the structure would be very similar, at least from my understanding. There are a lot like Warren is a common anti-Blackness author and is like very heavily based on Heidegger, and Gillespie is very heavily based on Baudrillard. So there are definitely a lot of similarities in terms of how you sort of think about running those.
Is there like a specific way to learn them or something? Or
Do you mean in terms of learning the literature or in terms of learning how to go for it?
I'd say like both, because I think they're more like intertwined. Like you kind of need to know both.
Yeah. I think that learning it, like eventually you're gonna have to cut it at some point and have it on paper, but learning it, I've always found videos to be a lot more helpful because I think that they just explain it in ways that make sense. Um, I also think that like blog posts and things like that, I wouldn't cut them, but like I would read them because I think that getting that under, it's worth taking time to read things that you won't cut just because it'll give you an explanation of them. And then in terms of going for them, just watch as many rounds as possible. I can send you shoot me a Discord message after. I can send you rounds that I know of people who read both of those who are very good at it and have had a lot of success with it. Because they're definitely very successful arguments. I think that there's just a specific way to go about reading them. But yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
So this is really specific, but let's say I'm reading an existentialism AC and then someone reads a set call on neg. Insofar as I'm winning that existence precedes essence, could I make an argument that says Sekhal's theory of power is wrong because it states that like all like non-natives living on like once native land are settlers, but like it's assigning like all those people like the essence of being a settler? That's just not true.
Yeah. I think this is hard because I'm of K-Lit, Setcall is probably what I'm like least read on, and then existentialism and philosophy too. But in terms of what I have read from the both of them, I think that the argument about existence precedes essence, you are better. I think that when you're debating Phil versus critique, you are oftentimes better off not targeting like the oppressor side of the critique and more the oppressed side of the critique. I think that if you say like, oh, it's bad that you are assigning the essence of settlerism to like white people, the 2NR makes a really good claim about like, oh, existentialism is just like a move, or like the way that they make this argument is like a move to innocence where they like explain away like white people's status as settlers. I think that the argument that like I know the argument that Gordon makes about Black existentialism, and the argument that I've hit with people reading existentialism against anti-Blackness, and the argument that like I would assume would work with based on the literature would be that existentialism explains that there is an inherent sort of form of life and existence within like indigenous peoples or colonized peoples, and so an sort of existentialist frame creates motivation and movement towards different sort of political situations or philosophical situations in which we deny settler colonialism. And it makes for basically just a good perm argument where you're like, we are able to resolve this, or the history of settler colonial violence is best explained by not recognizing the existence of settler of like colonized peoples, and that sort of like an existential view would allow for a reorientation that allows recognition of like colonized peoples and indigenous peoples, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think it would depend on specifically also what the affirmative is and how it's based in existentialism, because I'm admittedly not the most existentialist, or like the only existentialism app that I really know super well is like the Heidegger app. But and I think, well, I mean, yeah, I know the existentialism responses on the, or were the responses to Pest on the Heidegger app were existentialist. But yeah, so that's where like most of my understanding is from now. But I would say that yeah, that's probably targeting sort of the group that is affected and the oppressed group in the critique is the better move than explaining away the system in its entirety, if that makes sense.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah. And anyone else? I'm free to answer. It can be about the critique generally, anything we talked about today. Neil or David, if you guys have more questions too, don't feel limited or anything like that. So I'm free to sort of answer about anything.
What would like a CapK link into like an anti-blackness app look like?
That's a really good question. I think that the CapK specifically, I think every critique literature base is able to be very broad and very like there's a lot of different directions it can go. I think the CapK especially is very, very broad. But the best, in my opinion, links against anti-blackness for the CapK are links about aesthetic politics, which basically says that like it can incorporate things about like the academy and academic theorizing, or just theorizing about like society in general and social positions is a distraction from material politics. And so that should incorporate a few things. First is an argument about how capitalism is able to explain, like, yeah, analyzing capitalism or theories about capitalism are able to explain anti-blackness, not in its entirety, but a claim about how capitalism is able to explain the justification, i.e., like capital gains, economic gains from owning slaves is the reason why slavery existed in the first place, right? Or claims about how the capitalist conditions that create and position Black people in specific situations is what allows for anti-Blackness to continue to happen. So winning that capitalism is a substantial part of anti-Blackness, and then winning that the way the affirmative has thought about anti-Blackness is a distraction from those material politics, which has the impact of, if you've distracted from the main thing that enables anti-Blackness, then you are only creating more anti-Black violence. And so it doesn't require you to win that capitalism is what created anti-Blackness. It doesn't require you to win that destroying capitalism destroys anti-Blackness. Like, those are very big, grandiose claims that are like maybe true, maybe not true, probably not true in most cases. But you win that capitalism is what enables anti-Black violence to happen in a lot of situations, and that the affirmative has distracted from any type of positive solution that allows us to solve specific instances and specific like institutions that allow for anti-Black violence to happen. And then the alternative, it could be a common one, or a good one I've seen is Black Maoism, which basically just says that we should draw on like a history of like Black organizers who use Maoism to think about the world and about how capitalism creates anti-Blackness. So it gives you a lot of good historical examples, like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, or the Black Panther Party in the United States, or groups who have understood the way and analyzed the way that capitalism is what enabled anti-Black violence to happen. But in general, links about that, about how the affirmatives like social politics distract from a material politics, and how that causes us to ignore capitalism as a key aspect of enabling anti-Black violence, is probably like the best or the strongest CapK link in terms of standing up throughout the round.
Do you know any people that have like ran that specific CapK link that are like on the wiki?
Yeah, Harris's wiki has some good Black Maoism stuff. Specifically from, he read it at Princeton against me for sure. I think there's probably a couple other rounds, but that's probably the one of the better like CapK against like anti-Blackness app that I've seen. Does anyone else have any other questions? Can be about that or can be about other stuff generally.
Do you have any tips on like researching like links and stuff? Because like there's stuff on the wiki, but it's not like super specific.
Yeah. Honestly, I would, maybe this is a personal thing. I always cut all my own prep and I always cut most of my own prep and most of my own links. I think with links especially, I think with like framework cards or like theory cards, you're probably fine. But link cards, you want to have really good depth of understanding. So I would definitely like not. I would try to avoid finding links on the wiki as much as possible. In terms of researching, Google Scholar is good. I think that the I also think Google search terms are good. Like just general Google. I think depending on the critique, you can I think most critiques come with a built-in argument about why you don't need like a super robust academic source. About like if you are like reading set call, for example, you would just say that like the academy is like a settler tool that is used to exclude like indigenous and colonized forms of knowledge. Same, like very similar argument for anti-blackness. Capitalism would say that the academy is like a capitalist tool. So a lot of times don't feel, I think that the best links are usually in academic literature. I think that there are a lot of literature. I think there's a lot of links that can be found in things that you would not consider to be traditionally academic sources. And so that you should feel comfortable cutting a link from there every once in a while, as long as it's saying something that makes sense and that has a good warrant. You should feel comfortable cutting those. I think that also, I know you were talking about postmodernism earlier. I know there's like an International Journal of Baudrillard Studies. Finding things like that are really good because like they're super robust and have a lot of literature that's based on one specific thing. And so you can kind of just like go through and mine and find like really good stuff for it. And then just using like keywords when you first start a search, like have it be very general to the like sort of topic, and then kind of narrow, right? So as you search, as you like read an article, let's say you're reading an article for the next topic about like carbon pricing, right? And so you read an article about carbon pricing, and then like you see like something else come out, right? And so you're like, oh, okay, I'm gonna take that specific term, comma, anti-blackness, and then enter it in the search term, or comma Baudrillard and enter it in the search term, right? Or hyperreality, or a specific part of any word that comes into that literature. And so the sort of more specific you'll get, it'll take you down holes that'll get you into very specific territory. And even if it's not about, even if the link doesn't specifically say like, oh, carbon pricing, that search about carbon pricing will lead you to something that's like similar enough to where you can kind of work it and pull it together, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, also one more thing. This
Yeah.
one's kind of related to the last question, or like what the question about links. So I've seen like sometimes like people like kind of like apply links, like they have like a link for like environmentalism or whatever, but it doesn't, like, let's just say it doesn't mention carbon pricing in it, but in they like power tag it. So like they say like, okay, this whatever it is applies to carbon pricing, even though it doesn't really have it in the card. Can you kind of just like apply, I guess, like links to the card?
Most definitely. I've definitely done that like a lot. Honestly, like I did not start reading like super specific links until like halfway through senior year. I think that that's like fine to do. The main thing that you want to do is think about in cross and then in the 2NR, or if you're on the AF, in cross and in the 1AR and then the 2AR, being able to contextually apply that and explain that, right? So you should have a really in-depth and clear understanding of whatever the concept that's in the card is. You should have a really clear understanding of what's in the card. And then two, you should have a really clear understanding and articulation of how does this apply, right? So as long as you're able to do that work and make that argument, like it's no problem at all. You just want to be like very clear and very strong when you're explaining what the link is based on sort of like whatever the card is that you just read. But yeah, that's definitely something that I've done and that a lot of people do, where you just, you kind of cross apply a lot of things, which is another reason why you shouldn't really sweat if you're not able to find like a specific link that says like, oh, carbon pricing is the creation of the hyperreal or something like that.
Okay, thanks.
All right, cool. Anyone else have any other questions or thoughts about anything we talked about today? Okay, awesome. Well, I think we're good. If you do have any questions, feel free to, I think everyone is in Discord. So feel free to shoot me a message on there. If not, just get in touch with Daniel and he'll get you in touch with me. But thank you guys so much for having me today. I really enjoyed the lecture. I hope you guys did too. And yeah, if you need anything, have any questions, feel free to reach out. So I think that's all from me. Daniel, are they good to go? All right. Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.
Really? That's on oh, I can maybe send that out. That's from like my Princeton prep from last year. I could probably send that somewhere. But yeah. Fossil fuel. United States ought to ban the extraction of fossil fuels on federal public. So yeah, I enjoyed that. Yeah, that was that app. I enjoyed that a lot. It was a wake work app, so that was why I cut that. But yeah. Awesome.